Hello, this is Jacob Polite, managing editor of the Meramec Montage student newspaper. The following is an unedited, complete version of an interview conducted with Meramec political science professor John Messmer on Monday, February 3rd, regarding President Donald Trump's return to power and the implications of his second term. One of the topics in the interview discussed was tariffs against foreign nations. Just before the interview was set to begin, the Trump tariffs on Mexican goods were put on hold as a result of an announcement from the president that negotiations were beginning between the two nations. After the interview was completed, it was announced by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that tariffs on Canadian goods were also put on hold in a similar manner. That information is not reflected in the following interview. With that in mind, please enjoy. Why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself and how long you've been teaching here?
My name is John Messmer. I'm a professor of political science, and I've been here at Meramec since, 2002. So 23 years, which is amazing.
And you've also run for public office in the past, correct?
Yeah, in 2018, I ran for the Democratic nomination for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District.
Okay.
Came in 4th out of 5 candidates, so the top 80% of candidates.
Would you say that you're more of a Democrat these days as well, or?
Well, I certainly, not to split hairs here, but I don't think someone is a Democrat or a Republican unless they are literally a member of those parties. These are private organizations, and so if you pay dues and you go to their meetings, you can call yourself a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Rotary Club member, or whatever. These are organizations. And so when you say, are you a Democrat? I'm not a member of the Democratic Party. Do I lean towards Democratic policies? Absolutely. Do I vote almost exclusively for Democratic candidates these days? Absolutely.
Okay. So as you know, we have a new president. Donald Trump was inaugurated on Martin Luther King Day. And since then, he's made quite the impact, for lack of a better word. With all the executive orders that he's passed, with all the policies he's looking to implement. Specifically, a big thing right now is the tariffs that he's looking to implement. I don't know if you saw just about an hour ago, he announced that the tariffs with Mexico are on hold as they're negotiating.
Right.
But just for everyone listening who may not understand, explain it to me like I'm 5. What is a tariff? Or how would you define a tariff more appropriately?
A tariff is a specific kind of tax. And it's a tax, and most people, even I think a 5-year-old, can understand a tax is like an added cost, right? When you buy a candy bar, sales tax, that's an added cost, right? And like that candy bar tax, this is a tax that is an extra cost that goes to the government. So there's no doubt about it. This tariff on goods coming from other countries is a tax, and that's money that's going to go to the government. The problem, of course, is when you put an extra tax, again, it's called a tariff on goods coming in from other countries. Those who bring in the goods, like the stores that buy these products, when they decide to turn it around and sell it to the consumer, they are almost always going to put that extra cost on the price of the good. So it's a tariff on goods coming in from different countries. In the case that you mentioned, China, Canada, and now Mexico, though the Mexico one, as you mentioned, is put on hold. When those products are now sold in the United States, they're going to be more expensive. If they're not going to be more expensive, then the company that has to pay this tax is not going to make as much money, which hurts that company. And so that helps explain why the stock market takes a hit whenever anyone talks about imposing tariffs, and especially when people start using the term trade war. It becomes a trade war when the countries you put this tariff on decide to retaliate, just like any war. You can't fire into across a country's border without expecting that country to defend itself, and that's exactly what these countries are suggesting they're going to do. So, as a consumer, not only does this now mean that foreign goods are going to be more expensive, because again, the tariff is going to be passed on to the consumer, but it also means that if you are an American manufacturer or you rely on American manufacturing, that good is going to be more expensive overseas, which ultimately means the American manufacturer is probably going to be punished. So if it sounds like nobody wins when it comes to a trade war, you're right. And that's why, starting after World War II, the United States was a global leader in liberalizing our economy. Right? What does it mean to liberalize the economy? Well, in this sense, it means knocking down trade barriers at every turn. And there is no greater trade barrier than a tariff.
Why do you think that the president thinks that these tariffs will help the economy ultimately? If what you describe, if how you just described it is the way it goes, why do you think he's implementing these tariffs when do you think he realizes it's going to hurt the American electorate as much as he thinks?
I've got two ways of answering that. One gets kind of specific and draws upon what he has said, and then the other answer is what I suspect by taking a much sort of broader picture of what Donald Trump is about. The specifics, you go to his words, and he says he's doing this to retaliate against specifically Mexico and Canada because as he sees, a couple of things. He says they're being unfair when it comes to making trade with the United States. And second, in particular with Mexico, he's saying Mexico isn't doing enough to keep illegal immigrants from crossing the border. Most of them are not Mexican, but they're Central Americans that are coming through Mexico. And also, they're not doing enough to keep fentanyl out of the United States. As we all know, fentanyl is a problem. Fentanyl addiction has become an epidemic in the United States. Now, is that all because of Mexico? Of course not. But Donald Trump argues by imposing these tariffs, by making it harder to do trade back and forth with Mexico, that this is going to force the Mexicans to change their policy when it comes to things like fentanyl and other things, specifically when it comes to the border. Now, why he's picking on Canada, I'm not so certain of. There, it's more economic. He thinks that we are, as the world's largest economy, that we can take advantage of our weaker, northern neighbor. To a much lesser extent, he's arguing it with China. He thinks that China could do a lot more when it comes to selling American goods in China. He feels as though it's not a fair relationship. That, in a very, very broad nutshell, is his specific arguments as to why he's doing this. The much more broader argument is that he wants to see the American economy transformed. Why? Well, it's not because the American economy isn't doing well. The economy is doing very well. We haven't had a recession in a very long time. Stock market is up, unemployment is down, inflation is finally in check. You ask voters, and this was one of the main reasons they voted against Kamala Harris. They saw her as just being a continuation of Biden, and somehow Biden was painted as a failure when it comes to the economy. The numbers say differently. But what Donald Trump, I think, and supporters of Donald Trump want is a revolutionized American economy. They don't want to see the American economy, ultimately, down the road, as a testament to liberal economics. They want to see it in control of populist economics. And here's where it gets into sort of the weeds philosophically of the differences between liberalism and populism. Liberalism in this context means recognizing that people have fundamental value, And it also means that the world should recognize these universal values and do everything it can to further and foster cooperation. The populist argument, and Donald Trump, for the most part, is that he's a populist, argues that the job of the government should be to do what the general consensus is among the population. Whether or not that steps on fundamental rights or not. The problem with the populist approach is, quite frankly, it goes against what this country was founded on. This liberalism that I'm talking about isn't, AOC or Bernie Sanders liberalism. I mean liberalism in the classic sense, in the John Locke sense, who was an English political philosopher of which the founding fathers relied on. The liberalism that I'm talking about is the liberalism of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the countless trade agreements that the United States has engineered since the end of World War II. Despite the fact that the United States has prospered in this liberal environment, a liberal environment that it helped foster after World War II, for some reason, Donald Trump and the MAGA movement want to, gotta find the right word here, at the very least challenge it, if not outright destroy it. And I don't think that's what enough people appreciate.
I'll circle back around to Donald Trump's relationship with with the electorate in a moment. I do kind of want to focus a little bit on education and the effect that this next administration may have on education as a whole. We hear a lot of, of course, he named Linda McMahon as a Secretary of Education. I don't believe she's gone through the confirmation process for that yet. But under the assumption that she gets confirmed, what do you think they mean, or what would you say that they mean when they say we want to take education and give it back to the states? What's the difference between federal oversight of education and state oversight?
Well, it gets back to what I said in the previous answer. By removing the federal government's overall national approach towards education and by putting it in the hands of local communities, you're embracing populism at the expense of liberalism. Now, on the surface, populism sounds great. Community control of anything, but especially something as critical and as important to communities as education, sounds great. But populism basically favors the majority at the expense of the minority. And especially when you're talking about education, those that do not find themselves in the majority should be frightened by the prospect. And we already see it. Attacks on people of color, attacks on people that are not, heterosexual, by giving control to local school districts, to allow them to ignore, up until this point, federal protections on a lot of these targeted classes. Sounds like it's great for the communities, but it's a bad idea for Americans that don't find themselves in the majority. And again, it goes, and this idea of protecting the minority, occasionally at the expense of the majority. To a lot of people, that doesn't sound unfair. That doesn't sound fair. I'm here to tell you, that's the liberalism that this country was founded on. And so what we have done when it comes to education is that we've always had this sort of dance between what the community wants and what the federal government insists upon. And I think in hindsight, most people would agree we occasionally do need the federal government to come in and tell school districts, what they're doing is wrong. After all, we did that when it came to segregated schools, right? It took a Supreme Court case regarding interpretation of the federal Constitution to force schools to integrate. And realize what that Supreme Court case did. It's Brown versus Board of Education, and it forced school districts to recognize that it has to treat people equally and not divide their services based upon the color of one's skin. Well, if you're in a community that is overwhelmingly white, where the idea of segregating white kids from black kids is extremely popular, you see this action by the Supreme Court as federal government aggression. And at the time, in the 1950s, people, especially in the South, lost their minds. Time is a funny thing. We look back at that, and most people can agree. Liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats agree in the year 2025. Yeah, it's a good thing the federal government did that. I think a lot of communities, especially when it comes to school, are on the verge of making the same bad decisions when viewed upon historically. And they don't realize what is happening when you divorce school districts from federal government guidance.
Specifically, do you think there'll be a difference in the effect on secondary education in the college level? And by that I mean, do you think that it will affect, more K through 12 education than it will, like, say, an education a student might get here?
Well, it's just a matter of time before what happens on the K through 12 level manifests itself here. I mean, if it affects the quality and the opportunities of students on the K through 12 level, it'll affect those who leave the K through 12 level and are looking for higher education. So, no, we're not really affected as much as K through 12 school districts are, but we do often face the consequences that K through 12 districts face.
Okay. Going back to Trump and his relationship with the electorate, we see a lot of commentary in the media that Trump is attempting to make good on his promises, whether the promises that he's making will violate the Constitution or not. What do you make of Trump, who has served in this role before? What do you make of his actions, executive orders that seek to overturn parts of the Constitution, like birthright citizenship?
Well, the courts have already decided that it's ludicrous. Nothing could be more obviously unconstitutional than that order. But in a much bigger sense, the birthright citizenship that's a no-brainer. No court is going to allow that. It clearly violates 180 years of how we interpreted that part of the 14th Amendment. But in a much broader, serious sense, the essence of our Constitution is to limit power, particularly executive power. What Donald Trump is doing and his supporters are encouraging, and what members of his party in Congress are just looking the other way at, is him consolidating more executive power. Nothing could be, in the grand scheme of things, more unconstitutional than that. So his entire presidency is about a very unconstitutional new standard. I say new. We've had presidents that have wanted to consolidate that power, but never a president as so brazen in his disregard for these constitutional traditions like Donald Trump.
What do you make of the perceived apathy? Maybe apathy is not the right word. What do you make of the perceived lack of action from the Democratic Party that many feel is happening?
I don't know what that means. What can the Democratic Party do? I mean, I heard criticism of someone online that I was in a debate with was upset that Democrats ate lunch with Donald Trump at his inauguration. Like sharing crab cakes with Donald Trump is the worst thing we can do. it was a tradition. It's part of the idea of the peaceful transfer of power, no matter how much you might hate the incoming president. Up until Donald Trump not attending Joe Biden's inauguration, presidents have always followed in that tradition. It's what stable democracies do. So I don't know, with all due respect, and it's a good question because I've heard it before, I don't know what they're talking about. Do they want members of Congress who are Democrats to no longer show up at their jobs? Do they want Democrats who work in the bureaucracy to stop going to work? Do they want Democrats that are in the U.S. military to go AWOL? I don't exactly know what they mean by that. The voters decided to give both the House and the Senate to the Republicans. You throw in a Republican president, there's no hiding from responsibility. Everything that's good and bad that is going to be done by the federal government is solely on the shoulders of the Republican Party. It's going to be up to the voters to decide what to do about it, first in the midterms, and then when it comes to replacing Donald Trump in 4 years.
Kind of circling back to something you just mentioned, and I know it's probably been asked a lot over the last couple months, where do you think the Democratic Party went wrong in the last election? What do you think they could have done better in terms of messaging, in terms of really anything?
This is a minority opinion, but I don't think there's anything they could have done differently. And with all due respect to the question, this is like asking a victim of sexual assault, what were you wearing? You're blaming the victim. The question is, why on earth did one of our two major political parties, and it is among the responsibilities of our major parties, to act as a guardrail to make sure the worst of us don't get a chance to make their case? How could we have allowed the Republican Party to allow this catastrophe of a candidate and a movement to see the light of day? In the old days, when our parties were a lot stronger, someone like Donald Trump wouldn't have been allowed within a mile of their party's presidential nomination. I think we were better off when we had strong parties. For about 2 weeks, the Republican Party, this is way back in 2015, the Republican Party did stand up to Donald Trump. That was about for 2 weeks. And then they decided, if we can't beat him, let's join him. That should be the real question. How did one of our major political parties, the once proud Republican Party, how could they have so easily gotten rid of their integrity? And that's what it comes down to, by allowing themselves to be led by someone like Donald Trump, someone that shows no faith in our electoral process, someone who refers to the pillars of a republic as the enemies of the republic. Again, these are the actions of a populist who says things to garner an emotional, passionate response, and then ride the wave of that passionate response to more political power. This is nothing new. We've seen populists, sometimes they're referred to as demagogues, riling up the voters, fooling the voters, and then reaping the benefits. What's different is that we've had political parties that have kept the worst of these candidates off to the margins. The Democrats had their share of awful people, and the Democratic Party kept them away. The Republicans had their share of awful people. You had a guy by the name of Joseph McCarthy, right? We had the John Birch Society. The Republicans kept them away. But something changed with Donald Trump, and they allowed him to infiltrate and I use the term infiltrate because it's like, an enemy, and he is, and his movement is an enemy to traditional American politics. Now, you ask somebody, an ardent supporter of Donald Trump, and they'll argue, well, American politics needs an enemy, needs a revolution, and so I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree when it comes to that.
Do you, kind of piggybacking off that question, do you think that Donald Trump can't constitutionally run again after this term? So do you think that more candidates in the future will act like Donald Trump on either side, or do you think that there is a possibility that we'll return to kind of like the pre-Trump politics?
Fantastic question. Great arguments can be said for both answers. American history tells us that we are a sucker for personalities, not so much for the message of that personality. And so, given that history, the argument can be said that this is just unique to Donald Trump. And so once Donald Trump leaves politics, and eventually, and it may be further when he dies, that Trumpism, the MAGA movement, dies with him. Okay. Because as much as there might be some that would want to walk in his footsteps by mimicking his same rhetoric and embracing his same policies, if history is right and it's not so much the policy that people are attracted to, but the personality, then it doesn't matter how closely someone mimics Donald Trump. They'll never be like Donald Trump, and therefore the movement will die. But I'm not too sure of that. I'm not too sure. I think the Republican Party has shown that there is potential victory afoot by appealing to the worst fears of the American voter. And though I think both parties always suspected that, it wasn't until the Republican Party embraced Donald Trump that we knew it was true for the 21st century. So I didn't answer your question, other than to say it's a great question and you can make a solid argument for both sides.
Going forward too, and obviously this is just pure speculation because it's very early on, who do you think that the Democratic and Republican candidates in 2028 may be?
Well, you go with the obvious favorite among Republicans, and that this is true. It's not unique to Trump or this current administration, but if a president is going to be termed out, and the argument is it's a relatively popular president, and I don't know if we're going to be saying that about Donald Trump 4 years from now, but you got to put your money on his vice president. So I would say the odds-on favorite for the Republicans in 2028 would be the current sitting president, J.D. Vance. The fact that he's young, absolutely. And people are going to be tired of 80-year-olds. So J.D. Vance, it makes sense, and that's why J.D. Vance has to be careful these next 4 years, not to step on too many toes. Don't want to burn any bridges, right? The Democratic side is a lot tougher. Does Kamala Harris still have a future? I doubt it. Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, possibly. There's a couple of other Democratic state leaders, governors, that might have potential. Some people say, AOC, a very young voice, popular voice, dynamic voice, passionate voice, right now in Congress. And again, as mentioned, people are already sick and tired. They're going to be even more sick and tired 4 years from now of 70 and 80-year-olds running for office. How old is she? In her 30s, late 30s, maybe early 40s. She'll be seen as a breath of fresh air. Pete Buttigieg, the former transportation secretary, Um, uh, you know, I think he might represent the future of the Democratic Party too.
I don't mean for this to sound like a leading question, and hopefully it doesn't. So we've seen Donald Trump in 2 different presidential elections win against a woman, a qualified woman at that. Do you think that there is a preconceived notion in big parts of the electorate that a woman can't win a presidential election?
What a fantastic question. In so many respects, Kamala Harris in 2024 was a significantly stronger candidate than Joe Biden was in 2020. How on earth then did Joe Biden win and Kamala Harris lose? It's impossible to prove, but I think you'd have to be naive to not consider that there is still this not to be ignored thread of sexism that permeates American politics. Because you're absolutely right. You referenced Hillary Clinton too. You'd be hard pressed if you can divorce yourself about what you feel about them and their policies. You'd be hard pressed to find 2 more qualified candidates from either party running for president than those 2 women. And yet they still lost to someone, needless to say, is one of our most controversial political figures. I don't know. I'm sure there's some smart political scientist out there that's trying to find those Biden voters in 2020 that refused to vote for Harris in 2024. And either based upon interviews or by just looking at different, characteristics, can you draw some conclusions? What kind of voter would do that? And can you measure whether or not just blatant chauvinism, sexism is a factor? Without really dissecting, first collecting the data and then trying to interpret that data, it's not outlandish to suggest, there is something at play here.
Do you think that in the future a Republican Party will nominate a woman as a presidential candidate?
Given these 2 huge losses to the Democrats in 16 and now in 24, and the fact that both of those very highly qualified candidates were women, if I had to put my money down, I would say it's more likely, if we ever have a woman president, that she will be a Republican.
Okay.
Which, if I can remind myself, the leading woman candidate for that is Nikki Haley. Question about Nikki Haley is, did she burn too many bridges going against Trump in the primaries, which is another question. So,
kind of circling back to Trump and his relationship with the electorate again. And I believe we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I kind of wanted to elaborate on it a little bit more. What do you think it is about a perceived successful billionaire? Perceived because I don't really have the amount of money that he's made over the course of his life off the top of my head. What do you think it is about him and that personality with that level of success that appeals to like a rural voter?
Despite the fact that as a billionaire who was the son of a millionaire, Donald Trump ironically is perceived by many as being an enemy of the elite. Now, I would argue he's the definition of the elite, but he has successfully packaged himself to rural America as an enemy of the elite. Now, how does rural America define the elite? Well, they see the elite as an enemy of them. They see them as economically gaining while they're treading water. They see the elite as being more educated and using that education to look down upon them. They also see the elite as having questionable morals. They see the elite as more likely to be, atheist or hostile to organized religion. And they see them as being enemies of what they traditionally find sacred. Religion, but then also sort of the family unit. And they see the family unit as mommy, daddy, and a bunch of heterosexual kids, right? And so they see the elite as socially enemies to everything they hold dear. Incredibly, they see Donald Trump as someone that agrees with them when it comes to that, sticking it to the elite. And so that's the appeal of Donald Trump to rural America. Now, getting back to the very, 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 very first thing I said minutes ago, this is where the populist comes in, right? The populist is popular because the populist goes to the heart of what the community wants. Civil liberties, civil rights, be damned. The problem with that is that for the populace to achieve those things, they have to disregard the sanctity of things like our democratic institutions. And so it's no coincidence that the same person that rural America has embraced is the same person that thinks our elections are rigged, that thinks the deep state has control over our bureaucracy and our courts, who thinks that the world economy is being run by, globalists, whatever the heck that means. It's not a coincidence, right? That's what the populace does. And that is why those of us that care, not necessarily about liberalism, but just quite frankly about democratic institutions, need to stand up to that rhetoric and to that movement and to call them out on it.
Before we go, I want to talk a little bit about Trump and his relationship with the media. I'm just going to ask you point blank. Do you think that the media at large has normalized Donald Trump's behavior?
You know more than anybody that it should be aggravating and frustrating as hell just to refer to the media as this big monolith. There is conservative media that obviously has been his sort of propaganda arm, right? So they've definitely not just normalized him, but they have sort of downplayed the valid criticism of him. And this is valid criticism that some of his most ardent supporters, I think, could recognize and sympathize with, but they don't hear about this criticism because, again, it's right-wing media. So they've definitely normalized him. But you're talking beyond that. I don't know. They're calling him out. It's sometimes hard to realize the media is calling him out because it's like trying to drink out of a fire hose, right? There's so much information. There's so many things coming down, so many executive orders coming down, so many news of things, of earthquakes that he is imposing on traditional parts of the American government that we can't concentrate on just one thing. So I don't know what more the media can do. I will say, though, that it is troublesome that we're looking the other way when we have a president that has referred to the mainstream media as the enemy of the people. Again, this is what populists do in order to destroy liberal democratic institutions. And again, I don't mean liberal in the Bernie Sanders typical way of liberals versus conservatives. I mean the liberalism that this country was founded on. Democratic institutions and a free and independent media.
I'm going to ask another loaded question. Hopefully you feel comfortable answering it. we hear, or I've heard specifically a lot of talk in various parts of the political echo chamber that people think of Donald Trump as a fascist, or at the very minimum, somebody who exhibits fascist behaviors. Now, I'm assuming you've taught history before.
I don't teach history, but political science, yeah.
Yes. Do you think that he exhibits fascist behavior?
That's the in word. Nothing makes you sound more intelligent than using the word fascism, and then nothing sounds like a greater insult towards someone than to call him a fascist. I'm going to reiterate the words of John Bolton, who is someone that worked in the Trump administration. He's a foreign policy expert, controversial figure, worked under Trump, now is considered an enemy of Trump. When asked that same question, he said, Donald Trump isn't smart enough to be a fascist. Now, he wasn't suggesting that you have to be smart to be a fascist. What he was reminding us is that fascism is something specifically. Unfortunately, 90% of the time when people use the word fascist, they think they're just using a synonym for authoritarianism, for someone that wants to be a dictator, somebody that wants to consolidate too much power. And again, you don't have to be a huge student of history to know that whenever you concentrate power in just a few hands, that's a recipe for trouble, right? Dictators aren't good people, right? And the people usually suffer. But instead of just calling him a dictator, people have decided to call him a fascist. Why? Well, because of the history of fascism. Fascism is less than 100 years old, really. It started with Mussolini. Hitler was a fascist. And so we fought an incredibly brutal war against the forces of fascism. And so I think that's why people have decided to use the word fascist to describe an enemy of democracy. Granted, of course, Mussolini and Hitler were enemies of democracy. But that doesn't mean everyone that's an enemy of democracy is a fascist. Why people insist on using the word, I think it's just for the shock value. Now, does Donald Trump's brand of authoritarianism, what's he exhibited just in the last 3 weeks, are there some overlaps with fascism? 100%. Fascists, like Donald Trump, downplay the sanctity of democratic institutions. That's what Mussolini did, that's what Hitler did, that's what Donald Trump does. Do fascists emphasize nationalism? Absolutely, and so does Donald Trump. Where they differ, and I don't want to get into the nerdy political science weeds here, but where they differ is their embrace of what's called corporatism. Simply put, fascists don't believe in civil society. They believe that everything should revolve around state-sponsored interest groups, right? To give you a taste of what I mean by state-sponsored interest groups, Nazi Germany had something under Hitler called the Hitler Youth. The Hitler Youth was a social organization. It was for little kids. It was sort of equivalent to our Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. But unlike the Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts here in the United States, the Hitler Youth was actually organized by the Nazi government for little kids to indoctrinate them into strengthening the state, Nazi Germany. As bad as Trump is, as much criticism that is leveled towards Donald Trump, I haven't heard, and I might be mistaken here, but I haven't heard him talking about getting rid of civil society, having it be replaced by government organizations. Again, I'm sounding like a nerdy political scientist here, but I cringe when people decide to call him a fascist. Call him authoritarian. Call him a dictator. Call him, King Joffrey from Game of Thrones, right? Call him an awful leader. But don't use the word fascist as just sort of a synonym for just all dictators. Technically speaking, it's not true.
Okay. What do you make of his relationship with Elon Musk. And honestly, what do you make of his relationship with a lot of the tech oligarchs? Well, I don't know if oligarchs is the right word. What do you make of his relationship with the tech executives like Mark Zuckerberg, the president of TikTok? Have you ever seen an administration work so hand in hand with people in that field?
Not even close. Not even close. Now, an historian might remind me, maybe in the 1800s, presidents cozying up to the big railroad barons, and the industrialists back then, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the J.P. Morgans. But in my lifetime, I've never seen a president so shamelessly work with these big, powerful economic leaders. The delicious irony to this is what we were just talking about a few minutes ago. Part of Donald Trump's appeal is that he is seen as an enemy to the elites. How much more of an elitist can Elon Musk be, or Zuckerberg, or Bezos? When folks in rural communities are asked why they're so frustrated with the government, they'll talk about getting the short end of the economic stick, and they're right. We have failed them, both Republicans and Democrats, over the years. We've allowed communities that relied on industries that have now disappeared. We've allowed them to just disappear with these industries, or to hurt. Farming communities have been taken over by big industrial farms. Gone is the family farm. And we've allowed communities to suffer because of it. Yet these same supporters of Donald Trump and his anti-elitism, I'm curious as to how they feel when they're told that a guy like Elon Musk now has unprecedented civilian access to so much of the federal government. I mean, every day we're hearing more and more about what he is doing, despite the fact he's not a government official, and he was never confirmed to be in such positions of power by our elected representatives. It is truly stunning.
Moving back to Trump too, and thank you for addressing the Elon question, because I was just about to. But moving back to Trump, and I'm kind of surprised that we have not mentioned this yet. Trump is the first president to be a convicted felon when entering office. Now, in the future, do you think that the fact that we have a felon, even though his sentence is currently suspended by the New York State Court, how do you think that will affect the perception of the office, both at a national level and globally going forward?
Well, it cheapens it. And again, this is why I bring up the stuff about populism. The populace just cares about a strong man. And if that strong man is looking out for the common good, the strong man shouldn't be bothered by things like the rule of law. I mean, that's sort of the populist mindset. And we've seen in history people that probably shouldn't be given the privileges of power being given the privileges of power, again, because that's what people have clamored for. I think I mean this in all sincerity, I think in the long run, certainly in the short run, but even in the long run, this really damages so many things in American politics. It not only damages the office of the presidency, but it damages, like I said, the rule of law. It damages the sanctity of our elections, that we allow someone who went to war against our elections, we've basically given him a pass. We said, hey, that's okay. We're going to drop all charges against you, and federal charges have been dropped because Jack Smith was basically fired from his duties as an independent prosecutor. The only possible actions that are still possible against him are on the state level, the state of Georgia, possibly, but I wouldn't put my money on that turning it into anything. Yeah, I mean, his success, I think, weakens not only the office of the presidency, but other very important institutions. And it's going to take decades for us to heal from the damage that has been done.
Lastly, once again piggybacking off that question, but looking at it in a more narrow window, where do you think as a country that we will be in 4 years?
I think we'll be weaker. The question will be, will we have learned a lesson, and how will we translate that lesson into action? And by action, I would like to think this would translate into us electing reformers, people that are, once they're in office, are going to concentrate like a laser beam on how we can heal. I'm not sure if that's an answer to your question, but that's the best I got right now.
No worries. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.